She had 4 days before the boarding house landlady would put her belongings on the street, and 3 small reasons why she could not let that happen. The man sitting across from her in the sheriff's office had not spoken a word since she walked in, and she had run out of options before she ever sat down. This is not a story about a woman who was rescued. It is a story about a woman who had already been saving 3 lives on her own, and what happened when a silent rancher decided that was worth something. The ink on the paper in front of her smelled of iron and linseed oil, the kind of smell that meant something permanent was about to happen. Nora Callahan pressed her thumb against the edge of the desk to keep her hand from trembling and read the document one final time. Welcome to Dusty Vows, where stories like hers live. Subscribe now so you never miss one, and stay, because this one earns every minute. It was not a marriage certificate. Not yet. It was a contract, a labor arrangement, Sheriff Briggs had called it, with the dignity of a man who had negotiated livestock trades for 30 years and saw no reason to change his language now. The ranch required a housekeeper who could also keep books. The woman required shelter and wages. Both parties required discretion. The marriage, if it came to that, would follow in 30 days once both parties had assessed the arrangement. She did not ask what happened if one party found the other intolerable. She already knew. She would be back on this side of the desk with 4 fewer days on her clock. Her name was Nora Callahan, formerly Nora Briggs, no relation to the sheriff, who had been quick to point that out, widowed 14 months ago when her husband fell from the roof of their rented house in Caldwell and broke his neck on the frozen ground below. She was 29 years old. She had 43 cents, a carpet bag, a woolen coat that had belonged to her husband, and 3 children who were not hers by blood, but were hers by every other measure that counted. The children were waiting outside in the wagon. She had not mentioned them yet. The man across the desk was named Eli Voss. He was tall in the way that a fence post is tall, functional, unyielding, built to hold something in place. He had not looked at her directly since she sat down, which she had taken initially as rudeness and had since revised to something more like caution. His hands rested flat on the desk. They were the hands of a man who had spent 20 years doing work that left marks. A scar curved along his left thumb. His jaw was set in the particular way of someone who had already decided something and was merely waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. He signed without reading the last paragraph. She noticed that. Sheriff Briggs slid the paper toward her. You'll ride out this afternoon. Eli's got a man coming to fix the east fence tomorrow, and it'll need feeding after. She understood that she was the one expected to do the feeding. I'll need to collect my belongings from Mrs. Holt's boarding house, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she deserved. I have some things in storage there. Eli Voss stood. He was even taller than she had estimated. Wagons out front. Be ready in an hour. He did not wait for her response. She was ready in 40 minutes. She had to be. Mrs. Holt had made clear that morning that the room would be let to a traveling dry goods salesman by Thursday, regardless of whether Nora had found alternative arrangements, and Thursday was tomorrow. Nora collected her carpet bag, the small wooden box that held her husband's account ledgers, and the coat, that enormous, impossibly warm coat, from the hook beside the door. Then she collected the children. They came from 3 different hiding places. Maisie, who was 7 and had her mother's red hair and her father's stubbornness, emerged from beneath the stairs. Thomas, who was 5 and had not spoken a full sentence in 4 months, came out from behind the washroom door. And the baby, Pearl, who was 14 months old and mercifully still asleep, was retrieved from the nest of blankets Nora had made in the storage closet off the kitchen, where Mrs. Holt's cat had been keeping her warm with what Nora chose to interpret as providence. She bundled Pearl against her chest beneath the coat. She took Thomas by the hand. Maisie carried the wooden box without being asked. Eli Voss was standing beside the wagon when they came around the corner of the boarding house. He saw them from 30 feet away. He saw all of them. He saw the shape of Nora's coat and knew what it meant, and he saw Thomas's hand in hers and Maisie's careful grip on the box, and he stood very still for a moment in the way of a man recalculating something significant. Nora walked toward him and did not slow down. I should have mentioned, she said, that the arrangement includes 3 additional residents. I understand if that changes your assessment. Eli Voss looked at her for a long moment. Pearl shifted under the coat. Thomas pressed against Nora's side and stared at the man's boots. Then Eli Voss picked up Nora's carpetbag and put it in the wagon. "Get in," he said. "It's a long drive." He did not ask why. He just drove. The road from Caldwell to the Voss Ranch took 2 hours on a good day. This was not a good day. The October wind came off the plains horizontal and mean, carrying the first real bite of the season, and the wagon had no cover beyond a canvas tarpaulin that Eli Voss had wordlessly arranged around the children's side before climbing to the seat. Maisie had fallen asleep against Nora's arm within the first 20 minutes. Thomas sat rigidly beside Nora and watched the grass flatten in the wind. Pearl nursed and slept and nursed again, and Nora stared at the back of Eli Voss's broad shoulders and tried to determine what she had actually agreed to. He had said perhaps 6 words since they left Caldwell. She had said perhaps 10. The silence between them was not comfortable, but it was not hostile either. It had the quality of a held breath, 2 people waiting to find out what they had done. The ranch appeared in the late afternoon light as a cluster of weathered structures set against a rise of dry grass and sky. The house was larger than she had expected, though it wore its size plainly. No painted shutters, no curtains visible through the front windows, no indication that anyone had thought of it as a home in some time. The barn was sound. The fence around the near pasture was not. 3 horses watched the wagon arrive with the alert disinterest of animals accustomed to disappointment. A ranch hand named Gil, a wiry man of about 50 with a face like dried leather, came out of the barn and stopped when he saw the children. He looked at Eli. Eli looked back at him with an expression that said the subject was not open. Gil nodded and took the horses. Nora carried Pearl inside. Eli carried the carpetbag and the wooden box. Maisie walked herself in and stood in the kitchen doorway and assessed the room with the practical eye of a child who had moved too many times. "It needs cleaning," Maisie said. Eli Voss, who had followed them inside, stopped behind her. "Yes," he said. "We're good at cleaning," Maisie said. It was not a boast, it was an offering. He looked at the child, then at Nora. Something moved behind his eyes that was not quite an expression, but was the precursor to one. Then he set the box on the kitchen table and said, "There's a room at the back of the house, 2 beds. It'll do for the children." He paused. "You'll take the room off the kitchen." "And you?" she asked. "Upstairs." That was the arrangement. She understood it was meant as a boundary and received it as one. She spent the first evening feeding the children from the stores in Eli's pantry, dried beans and salt pork, nothing remarkable, but warm, and putting them to bed in the back room, which smelled of cedar and disuse, and was, she noted, swept clean. She did not think he had done it before she arrived. She revised that conclusion when she saw the fresh candle on the windowsill. She did not mention it. The first week passed in the rhythm of hard work and careful distance. Nora rose before the house was awake and had coffee on the stove before Eli came downstairs. She did not do it for approval. She did it because the kitchen was the warmest room, and Pearl woke early, and the iron stove needed tending regardless. If the coffee happened to be ready when Eli appeared, that was coincidence of circumstance, not effort made on his behalf. He drank it without comment and went out to the barn. She found the ranch's account ledgers on the 3rd morning, stacked on the shelf above the kitchen fireplace beneath a coffee tin, and 2 years' worth of invoices. She had not been asked to look at them. She looked at them anyway, because the numbers had a smell to her, the particular discomfort of figures that didn't balance, and she had been right about that smell since she was 15 years old, keeping her father's books in the back room of his dry goods store in Abilene. The Voss Ranch was not failing. It was being bled. Someone had been overcharging for feed and underpaying for cattle for 3 seasons running, and the discrepancy was small enough, line by line, to look like bad luck. Taken together, across 18 months of records, it was not bad luck. It was deliberate. She spread the ledgers on the kitchen table that evening after the children were asleep and worked by lamplight until she could see the shape of it clearly. Then she wrote it out in clean columns on 2 sheets of paper from her husband's box and left them on the kitchen table with a note that said simply, "This wants your attention. N." She was outside the next morning beating dust from the back bedroom rug when she heard the kitchen door open. She heard the pause. She kept beating the rug. Eli came out 15 minutes later. He stood at the edge of the porch and looked at her. She did not stop working. "Where did you learn to read accounts like that?" he said. "My father kept books. I kept them better." Another silence. The rug was clean by now, but she kept working. "The feed supplier is a man named Haskell," Eli said. "He's been with this ranch since my father's time." "I know," she said. "His signature is on 14 of the 18 discrepant invoices. The other 4 are unsigned, which is more interesting." He was quiet for long enough that she finally stopped and looked at him. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not anger, not suspicion. Something closer to attention, the kind a man gives when he's been caught assuming something and is revising his assumption in real time. "I didn't know you could do that," he said. "You didn't ask." She turned back to the rug. "The unsigned invoices are more recent. Someone started covering their tracks. This is Dusty Vows, where stories like hers live. Women who were underestimated, men who did not yet know what they were missing. If you want the next story the moment it arrives, subscribe now, then back to the ranch." He did not confront Haskell that week. Nora had not expected him to. A man like Eli Voss did not move fast when the ground was uncertain. He watched. He rechecked. She saw him in the evenings with the ledgers, cross-referencing against the dates she had marked, and she left him to it. She had given him the shape of the problem. What he did with it was his decision. What she did not anticipate was Gil. The ranch hand came to her on the 5th morning while Eli was out checking the east fence and Maisie was in the yard teaching Thomas to identify the horses by the sounds of their breathing. Gil stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and a look on his face like a man preparing to confess. "The unsigned invoices," he said. "2 of those are mine." She set down the bread she was kneading. "Sit," she said. He sat. He was not a dishonest man. She had understood that about him from the first day. He was a frightened one. Haskell had threatened Gil's brother, who owed a debt to a man in Dodge City. Gil had signed 2 invoices on Haskell's instruction to keep that debt from being called. He had not known the full scope of the scheme. He had understood enough to be ashamed. "Does Eli know about your brother?" Nora asked. "No." "Tell him," she said, "before Haskell does. He'll let me go." "He might." She returned to the bread. "But he'll respect that you told him yourself. And you'll be able to look at him when you do." She paused. "Haskell's going to move against this ranch. When he does, Eli will need to know who is standing with him and who isn't. You need to decide that now, not then." Gil left without answering. He came back 2 days later and told her that he had spoken to Eli. He said it without elaboration. She nodded and handed him a plate of biscuits to take to the barn and did not make anything of it. But she watched Eli that evening at supper, and she saw something had shifted in the way he held his shoulders, looser somehow, like a man who had been handed back something he had not known was taken. The second week brought the first cold snap and the first direct trouble. A man rode up to the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon while Eli was in town and Nora was in the garden with Pearl on her hip, trying to salvage the last of the winter squash before the frost took them. The man was dressed well for a ranch visit, too well, the kind of well that means the visit is not really about the ranch. He introduced himself as Warren Haskell, nephew of the feed supplier, and said he was there on behalf of a promissory note the Voss Ranch had signed with the Caldwell Mercantile Bank 3 years prior. He had papers. She recognized the shape of them from 10 feet away. "Mr. Voss is not here," she said. She did not put Pearl down, I'm aware. Haskell smiled in the way of a man who had timed his arrival deliberately. "But the note is due in full by the end of the month, and the bank has authorized transfer of the deed in lieu of payment if the terms are not met. I'm here as a courtesy, a chance for the household to prepare." Pearl grabbed a fistful of Nora's hair. Nora did not flinch. "What is the outstanding amount?" she asked. He told her. She looked at him steadily and did not react, though the number was significant. "I'll tell Mr. Voss you called," she said. "He'll want to review the original note before any further discussion." "Of course." Haskell looked at the house, then at her, with the measuring look of a man pricing an acquisition. "Congratulations on the arrangement, Mrs. Voss. I hope it suits you." She did not correct the name. When Eli returned that evening, she was at the kitchen table with the original banknote she had found in the wooden box under the false bottom she had discovered on day 3 and had not mentioned, because she had been waiting to understand why it was there. The note was not what Haskell had described. The original terms gave the ranch a 60-day cure period on any default. Haskell had either not read it or was counting on Eli not having read it. She was explaining this when she heard him go very still on the other side of the table. "There's a false bottom in the box," he said. "Your father kept documents there." She pushed the note across the table. "Read the third clause." He read it. She watched him read it. He was not a slow reader, but he read it 3 times. She understood why. He had been carrying the weight of what he thought was a losing hand for 3 seasons, and someone had just told him the cards were different. He looked up at her. For the first time, the controlled set of his jaw was entirely gone. "Nora," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. They both heard it. He did not say anything else, but he put his hand flat on the table, close to where hers rested, and did not move it away. He said he needed to ride to Caldwell the next morning to speak with the sheriff and the bank before Haskell made another move. She said she was coming. He said the road was rough and she had the children. She said the children were coming too, because she was not sitting in this house waiting for news of something she had already helped set in motion, and he could either make room in the wagon or explain to Maisie why she was being left behind. He made room in the wagon. Maisie sat beside him on the driver's bench because she had asked, and he had, after a pause that was nearly indistinguishable from refusal, moved over. Thomas sat in the wagon bed and watched the road. Nora held Pearl and watched Eli's profile and thought about the way he had said her name the previous evening and what it had done to the air in the room. In Caldwell, she presented the original banknote to Sheriff Briggs, while Eli stood 2 steps behind her with his arms crossed and the particular stillness of a man who is letting someone else lead and has decided he is at peace with that. Sheriff Briggs read the cure clause. His expression went through several stages. He called for the bank manager. The bank manager confirmed the clause. He also confirmed, under questioning from Nora that grew progressively more specific, that Warren Haskell had no legal authority to demand deed transfer, that he had represented himself as an agent of the bank without authorization. "That's fraud," Nora said, not dramatically, matter-of-factly, the way you name a fence post or a cloud. "It appears so," the bank manager said. From across the room, through the bank's front window, she could see Warren Haskell's horse tied at the mercantile. She looked at Eli. He was already looking at her. "I want the cure period in writing," she said to the bank manager. "Dated today, witnessed." The bank manager provided it. Haskell was confronted in the mercantile by Sheriff Briggs and 2 deputies 20 minutes later. Nora was not present for that. She was outside on the boardwalk with the children, Maisie eating a piece of hard candy that Gil had pressed into her hand before they left and sharing half of it with Thomas, Pearl asleep against Nora's chest in the afternoon warmth. Eli came out of the bank and stood beside her. They were both quiet for a moment, listening to the particular hum of a town that was watching something happen and pretending it wasn't. "He'll be charged," Eli said. "Briggs is thorough when it matters." "And the elder Haskell?" "The feed contract is terminated. Gil has agreed to testify about what he was told to sign." She nodded. The sun was warm on the top of her head. Pearl made a small sound in her sleep. "You found the false bottom on day 3, Eli said. It was not a question. "Day 3, she confirmed, "and you waited." "I waited until I understood what I was looking at." She glanced at him. Knowing where something is and knowing what it means are 2 different things. I needed to know what it meant before I said anything. He was quiet again. Then, quietly, "Why didn't you use it for yourself, the information? You could have made a different kind of arrangement." She looked at him directly for the first time since they had come outside. "Because it wasn't mine to use for myself. It was yours. I found it. That doesn't make it leverage. It makes it information I was trusted with, whether you meant to trust me or not." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly practical. Then he looked away at the street, at the horses, at the unremarkable mid-October sky. "The 30 days are nearly up," he said. She understood what he meant. The arrangement had a review period. At 30 days, both parties would assess. "I know," she said. "I'm not reviewing it," he said. "I'm done reviewing it." Something shifted in her chest, that specific rearrangement of something that has been held tightly for too long and is finally allowed to settle. He said her name differently that second time, quieter than the first and more certain. "Tell me, Did you hear that shift, or was it only her? Leave your answer in the comments. I read everyone. Now, back to the story. They drove home as the sun lowered behind the plains, painting the dry grass the color of old copper, and the cold came back in earnest as the light went. Eli put the tarpaulin around the children again, without being asked. Maisie fell asleep against Nora's shoulder. Thomas leaned against Nora's other side and watched the stars come out one by one, with the focused attention of a child practicing the faith that things would continue to appear. Nora looked at the back of Eli's shoulders and thought about the words. I'm done reviewing it, and what they meant in the mouth of a man who did not speak without meaning something. When they arrived at the ranch, Gil came out to take the horses and did not say anything about Haskell or the bank or any of it. He took one look at the three of them on the wagon seat and went back to the barn with something that was not quite a smile on his weathered face. Eli carried Thomas inside because the boy had fallen fully asleep in the last mile and could not be roused. He carried him with the practiced ease of someone who had done it before or had watched someone do it often enough that the motion had settled into him. He set the boy down in the back bedroom and pulled the blanket up to his chin and stood there for a moment in the dark of the doorway before he came back out to the kitchen. Nora was at the stove with Pearl in one arm and her free hand feeding the iron stove with the last of the evening wood. She heard him stop in the kitchen doorway. She didn't turn around. You're going to need to cut more wood before the hard frost, she said. The pile by the south wall's down to 2 days' worth. I'll cut it tomorrow. A pause. I'll teach Maisie to stack if she wants to learn. She'll want to learn. Nora set Pearl carefully in the kitchen chair, wedged with blankets, and turned from the stove. She wants to learn everything. He was still in the doorway. The lamplight reached him on one side and left the other in shadow, and he looked in that moment exactly like what he was, a man who had been alone in this house for a long time and was not entirely sure what to do with the fact that he no longer was. The room off the kitchen, he said. It's too cold in there at night. She looked at him. I'll move the iron stove connection to the main chimney. Give it more draw. It'll be warmer. He paused. It should have been done before you arrived. I didn't think of it. She understood that for a man like Eli Voss, this was the equivalent of an apology and a declaration and a promise all at once. She received it accordingly. Thank you, she said. He nodded. He started to turn back toward the stairs. Then he stopped in the doorway. That doorway pause, that threshold moment, and he looked at her one more time and said her name for the third and final time in a voice that was neither commanding nor careful, but simply true. Nora. She met his eyes. Yes, she said, not as an answer to a question he had not asked, as a statement of something she had already decided and was only now saying aloud. He stood there another moment, the lamplight warm against the side of his face, the cold pressing at the window glass behind her. Then he came back into the kitchen, and he put 2 more pieces of wood in the stove, and he stood beside her while the fire caught, and neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing left that needed saying. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass of the Voss ranch with the sound of something that had been waiting a long time to be heard. The horses in the barn settled. The lantern on the porch burned low and steady, and the kitchen was warm. She proved that survival and worth are not the same thing, and that knowing the difference is its own kind of courage. He chose her not because he needed her, but because he finally understood what it meant to want someone to stay. Tell me, would you have said yes in that kitchen or waited for more words? Leave your answer below. Next time, a woman named Ruth steps off a train in a town that already buried someone with her name, carrying a deed, a lie, and a child who calls her mother when no one is listening. Subscribe now so you don't miss her story.